Okay, this is a re-recording of a presentation that I gave at a recent Sydney Houdini User Group. So I thought I'll record this again, and then people who weren't there get to suffer through my voice again. Okay, so the topic is volumes, beautiful but slow, not always. And the reason that volumes generally tend to become slow a lot of the times is to do with the data overhead with volumes. And it's not always a sexy topic to talk about, but it's a super important topic, and it's one that I think gets glossed over and skipped by a lot of people, seasoned artists as well as new people coming into the industry. And I think that there's an over-reliance in saying that computers are faster, we have more memory, we have more storage space, but that's really, that shouldn't be how you look at this type of stuff. And I wanted to make a presentation on it. So let's step through it. Okay, so the major sort of touch points for inefficient volumes, the things that the problems it can cause. Number one, slower simulation time. That's very obvious. If you are over simulating with resolution that you do not need, then your simulation times are going to become slower. So that means it's going to become slower to iterate. It's going to be taking a lot longer to hit notes, and it's really not as enjoyable as it could be if things were as fast as they can be. So, I've made tools in the past, and I've included a HIP file with this that has a voxel resolution calculator so that you can be sure that you're always simulating at the resolution that you need for the given camera res to not be able to see blocky artifacts in your sim. So rather than just guessing or just kicking a sim off and saying, hey, this looks cool, you are sitting much more happy as far as knowing what resolution you should work at. Obviously, there's a point where if you are not simming at a high enough resolution, then certain forces, certain things that are happening in your sim, they don't resolve nicely. So, that's always a consideration. But, there's a balance between the resolution you need to get the fidelity of the forces in your sim versus just blindly throwing high resolution there and not really thinking about it. The next one is disk storage, and that one is huge. Contrary to popular belief, disk storage is not cheap and it is not free as far as overheads. So enterprise storage when you're working in studios is very, very expensive, and the overhead with disk storage is not just the cost that it takes to buy these disks, it's the amount of space that it takes up on disks. So that means if we've got 10 artists all generating a bucket load of data, then those disks are going to fill up much, much quicker. And you're not working in isolation, you're working usually in a studio. So that means that people working in other departments could end up being impacted by your work. So if you're generating the minimum amount of data possible, then no one can come back to you and say, hey, come on, make this a bit easier for everybody. That's what we're going to talk about today. Render times is probably the next one I want to touch on. The unnecessary voxel resolution means stepping over more voxels than you need to, and your render times are going to suffer. So render times aren't purely based on the voxel resolution, because there's also the overhead of dragging that cache from the server across to the render blade to actually render that frame. So if you have a smoke cache and it's pretty high res, but it's being used off in the distance, when it comes to rendering, that might be physically a quick render to get through because it's not occupying a lot of space on screen. But the overhead on the network to drag that huge file across was a hidden overhead, a hidden cost. So the render time stuff is a twofold thing. One is unnecessary resolution, means that we're stepping over more voxels than we need to. So we're going to have definitely slower renders. And tied closely to that is the overhead with the server I/O. Server I/O having to drag big caches across networks can literally bring down a studio. So that server I/O ties into not just dragging those caches across during renders, it's creating those caches in the first place when you're doing your simulations. So, servers do not have an infinite amount of I/O. They will bottleneck, they will slow down, and they will grind to a halt. And like I said, I've seen instances where a mid-sized studio can basically be ground to a halt purely by the amount of data that the effects department is usually generating, or that the lighting department is causing server I/O loads due to the size of those caches getting dragged across the network. So this, it impacts multiple people in multiple departments, inefficient volumes. Slow to IDON, we kind of touched on that already, that the higher res your sim is unnecessarily means that the sim time is going to increase and your iteration time is going to blow out. So, why would you want to do that? You want to have the most amount of stabs in 24 hours that you can with the effect that you're trying to do, because the end result is you're just going to create better artwork at the end of it versus only being able to iterate once or twice or 3 times and saying, hey, that's the best I could do, and you'd be getting CBB notes for the rest of your life. Final one, I think a lot of artists, even working in studios, seem to be completely forgetting this, and that is you're working with each other towards a common goal on the project that you're working on. And if you're going to generate much more data than you need to, and you're going to hit those bullet points that we've touched on about disk storage, about impacting render time, server I/O, slow to iterate, you're going to screw yourself, you're going to screw your fellow artists out of the most precious resource, which is time. So we don't have unlimited simulation farms. So if your simulation is taking 20 hours instead of 3 hours, then the person sitting next to you probably can't get their job on the farm to simulate because of your inefficiencies. So it's really important to think about the impact that your setups have across multiple departments and across multiple people, and including yourself. So yeah, that's my main take on the main inefficiencies with volumes. Next one, how do we reduce volumetric data? Obviously, we touched on voxel resolution. How much do you need for the given camera res, render res? Like I said, I have a tool for that, and I can show you that at the end of this. We'll dive into Houdini for 5 minutes and just quickly step through that stuff. Bit depth is another one. So 32 versus 16. The way that VDBs are stored, all the leafs in VDBs are, they're children of the parent, and the parent bounding box, the parent, origin, if you would, of the simulation, that is stored at 32-bit. So if it's off in the distance from the origin in the world, a certain amount, that's fine. It's not going to cause any problems. And the children are closely related in distance to the parent, so they don't need to always be stored at 32-bit. Most often they can probably be stored at 16-bit with 0 problems. So things like density definitely can be stored at 16-bit. Probably velocity as well. It's always good to benchmark and test when you're rendering this stuff where the cutoff point is. When I also mentioned, can you use 8? 8 might seem silly, but a lot of the time when we're rendering color volumes, let's be honest, you don't need any more than 8 bits of information for the colors, because we're not doing highly intricate fidelity of color a lot of the time with our smoke and our dust. It's generally tending to just give the dust or the smoke a little bit of a gradient, a little bit of a change over the course of its life or its density. So, with that, we're only sort of mixing that in with its what everything else is happening with our main albedo. 8-bit will probably be fine. So storing color at 32-bit blindly as a default is, it's going to waste a huge amount of space. Culling fields. Okay, so generally when you come out of a simulation, all of the fields that are involved in it that you're outputting, which is, probably if you're doing fire, you're going to be doing temperature and potentially flame, and you're doing density, you're definitely doing velocity. These fields are going to exist all around the simulation area. They're not necessarily going to be in areas where you're going to render. So if you have density and velocity, for example, with a simple smoke or a dust sim, you would have velocity potentially swirling many meters away from where any of your density is inside your simulation. You don't need those voxels for rendering, because the velocity field is just being used to smear the density field during rendering. You don't need information out there where there is no density. So the SOP Pyro tools and even the Pyro post-process SOP, they have this functionality on them for culling fields. And usually you're culling by the field that you're going to render. So density is a prime example. So you usually, the defaults in there are to cull velocity by density. So where density doesn't exist, velocity voxels don't exist. And it's not trivial, because just culling unnecessary velocity from your sim can probably take 20%, maybe more, depending on what's going on in your sim, out of your cache size. Related to that is resampling. Generally, the fields that you want to render, you probably don't want to resample them. You want them to be at the voxel res that you simulated at. So density, for example, temperature, flame, maybe you're going to leave them completely alone. But unless there's a really high fidelity reason to do it, velocity a lot of the time can be resampled to be half the resolution, half as accurate as the other fields, since we're just using the velocity field to kind of smear at render time. And resampling and culling the velocity field usually results in about a 65 to 70% reduction in your total VDB cache size on disk. So it's huge. The overhead of the velocity field is usually more than all the other fields combined. So it's definitely one to absolutely, stick to culling it, resampling it where you can. And the last one is a tool that I've used for a couple of years, and it's finally in Houdini 20. It's been part of the OpenVDB toolset for a couple of years, but it hasn't been in Houdini 19.5 for reasons. So it's now in Houdini 20, and it's a Frustum-Based Rasterizer, which we'll step through in the next couple of slides. It's a camera-orientated voxel grid versus a Cartesian one orientated to the world. So let's jump into the next couple of slides to explain that a little bit easier rather than just these bullet points. Okay, so I've got an example here of a quick sim that I did, which is just, generic white water sort of hitting a beach wall. The standard way of rasterizing these particles with the SOP rasterizer, volume rasterized attributes, generated a cache of about 313 megabytes. Now, the one on the right is using the Frustum orientated voxel setup, and this one's generating a cache of about 36 megabytes. So it's a huge difference, and fidelity wise, rendering wise, it's identical. Really, there are little tweaks that you need to do when you opt into this, and that's more shader and density tweaking, because it's not a simple one-to-one with switching between the two different rasterizers. You will, obviously, if you're going to opt into Frustum stuff, then you have a slightly different shader tweak or two, but it's not much. Another amount of space saving is huge, and let's just look at this cache. This is the result of this. So this is orientated to the camera Frustum. It's not a Cartesian orientated volume, and there's no artifacts. This thing is rendering completely correctly. It's been used extensively in a lot of shows, and I tend to use it for anything that I'm turning into this kind of splashy whitewater stuff, or particles where things are coming off trails that are far away from camera and coming close to camera, because the rasterizer will not just do this thing in Frustum space. It will also be setting the voxel resolution in XY for the camera plane. It'll be setting the voxel resolution dynamically. So as those particles are further away from camera, their voxel resolution is going to be reduced. As they get closer, it goes up. So this is something where the resolution is dynamically changing frame to frame and where particles are in depth. So let's come back to the slide, jump to the next one. Okay, this is a nice simple example. So on the left, we have regular Cartesian orientated rasterizing, which is what we've all been using for years. And this is still completely valid, and it's not going to be replaced by Frustum, but Frustum stuff where it makes sense with certain elements is definitely the preferred way to do rasterizing. There are obviously conceits that you have here. When you're rasterizing in a Cartesian grid, you can cache that VDB and you could reuse that VDB wherever you want it, because it's not locked to a specific camera. The Frustum ones are locked to a specific camera, so you obviously cannot reuse them if the camera is different or if the camera moves. But in practice, you could simply be loading that particle cache into another shot if you want to reuse it, and Frustum rasterizing from there. It does technically generate more data because you're doubling up, but because you're sometimes 10 times smaller in data size, doubling up even 2, 3, 4 times if you're reusing this cache across multiple shots still ends up being a smaller cache than the original one stored on disks. So the frustum orientated one is exactly how it sounds. The grid is now being aligned to the X, Y, and Z of the camera. So Z being depth, and the depth one is the one that we get the most amount of savings resolution wise. And just coming in here, this is the setup which we'll go into in a minute in Houdini. Rasterizing with the traditional method on the left, and like I said, the cache size 313 meg versus on the right around about 36 megabytes with this little subnet, which is something that I should probably turn into an OTL and put a fancy icon on it, but oh well. So also to this is casting this with the Pyro post process, casting this to 16-bit. Even if you were just to stick with normal volume rasterizing, casting to 16-bit does present quite a whopping saving, down to 195 meg versus 313. You still get a decent saving from the frustum orientated one from 36 to 25, but since you're already down quite small, the savings aren't huge. They're still there, and it's something that we need to be aware of, that doing something as simply as casting to 16-bit can have huge ramifications. So, I can't bang on about this stuff enough. This data optimizing is pretty important, and we've got tools in here in the last couple of major releases of Houdini that we've usually used internally and little wrangles for. They're all there available to you, so there's really no excuse not to opt into it and not to start doing it. Okay, and volume compression, just another visual example of this is simple little Pyro sim on the left. Everything left at default. So it is a VDB, but nothing's been changed apart from the fact that it's been converted to a VDB post sim. So it's around about 34-ish meg on disk. Simply taking that sim and casting it to 16 and doing the culling that we're talking about, which you can see with these bounding boxes, they represent the active data in the VDB. So the one in the middle is having its velocity field culled by density. So we're starting to get much, much less leafs visible. So between casting to 16, culling velocity, and then resampling velocity, we've now gone from 34 meg to 3.2 meg for the same fidelity. We would literally get the same result if we rendered this, and that to me is a huge saving. And the one on the right is another step in the related area, which is still doing exactly what the one in the middle is doing, but since we're putting a camera frustum in here during the simulation, we're saying, hey, anything that moves outside the camera frustum, we don't care in this shot. There's no lighting that's going to be coming from above that is going to give away the gag that we've cut volume voxels outside of the frustum. This one has got a further saving. So, these stuff, we can really drill down. We can get these things really, really, really low. And I think that there's, with that suite of tools, with all of the obvious ones of culling and resampling and casting, plus things like frustum culling as well, either in the sim to keep memory down in the sim or post sim before you write the cache to disk, is it's pretty important, and it's a pretty cool suite of tools. So that's the main sort of overview of that stuff. Let's just jump into Houdini really, really quickly and a couple more examples. So voxel resolution stuff. Okay, I've got a really simple scene set up here with just some it's just a grid. It's going to have some density, and we're going to say that we're looking down the barrel. This is 300 or 400 meters in depth, so it's quite a lot of depth from extreme foreground to the camera all the way off into the distance. It's a decent amount of distance. Now, the naive approach to this could be to do this simulation all together, and the downside of that is obviously if you need to have smoke or dust, whatever it's going to be, super close to camera, then the resolution that you need that close to camera is going to be the same resolution off in the distance. So that should straight away set off alarm bells that once you start being 50, 100, 150, 200 meters in depth, that you should be slicing this simulation up and you should be calculating the ideal voxel resolution. So here's the checker that I've made. It just contains some housekeeping stuff, and the main crux of it is this wrangle for working out from the camera and the resolution of the camera what the ideal voxel resolution should be. And conventional wisdom over many years and talking to many people and testing it myself is that you need around 2.5 to 3 pixels per voxel. So you don't need 1 voxel per pixel. You can get away with having that 1 voxel be across a couple of pixels before you're able to discern the blockiness in the sim. So, I have the default here set up at at 2.5, and I have a cutoff here that, I'm saying, no, once this thing gets any closer to that, I don't care if this thing is calculating to the 4th decimal, I'm going to cut it off and say I don't care. I don't want to have anything less than 0.01 because, obviously I don't want to be simming with ridiculous resolution. So this tool has a few housekeeping things built into it. What I'm also using here with this is pretty cool labs tool, which actually has a bounding box tool to actually divide up. You can divide up your stuff into, it's a really good, easy little slicing sort of tool setup. So I've got this set up here to just, slice this thing up into 3, and the bounding box of this is going to be saying, okay, here's where I am, here's the bounds of this slice of the sim. The voxel checker is going to say what is the closest point, which it would be the points on the face of that bounding box that are closest to camera. What's the voxel resolution needed from that camera and the resolution that camera is rendering at. So I'm able to use that to sort of say, okay, well, here's my points. I'm going to rasterize these points, and these points are going to be ready to go into my sim. But the resolution of the voxels for the rasterizing, the resolution in, I might turn this off so it doesn't sim, the resolution in the sim is going to be tied to the same thing, the voxel checker. So if you were building a wedging setup, something like that, that's a quick and easy way to come through and just be going, all right, I've got these guys and they're going to be split and sliced across with that tool, and the resolution is going to be checked, and that's going to be piped into rasterizing and piped into simulation. So something like this, where we're coming out and we're saying, all right, this is the closest one to camera. This is generating 1.4 gigabyte of data at the resolution that I need for the given camera to not see any blockiness in the sim. So that's fine, okay? And then the next slice coming back, this one is generating around about 65 meg per frame. And it's obviously, because it's tied into the voxel resolution, when you render this, it looks exactly the same. You wouldn't discern any difference between them. And then the final slice, as you go even further back, this one's generating 11 megabytes per frame. So, like I said, the naive approach to this could have been to just simulate this all in one gigantic sim with the final resolution, which is what this one is, 0.03, all the way through. The simulation would take an insane amount of time, and on top of that, it would generate an insane amount of data and have a couple of other, which I hope, obvious issues. Looking at the results here, the closest to camera one, if we said this was a hypothetical shot, 300 frames, we're going to generate 420 odd gig of data, and then the next slice is going to generate 19 odd gig, and then the next slice is going to generate 3. So for a total overhead on the shot, this is a big shot. Let's say it's 4K and it's 300 frames, 442 gig. It's not that wild considering this could be a 4K resolution camera, which I think I did have it set to 4K. Anyway, so unsliced is at least 1.3 terabytes, probably more. So we're almost looking at a 3-fold increase in the amount of data that we're going to generate, and it's going to have a couple of other associated problems. The first obvious one is the amount of disk space, which is going to be horrendous, and the simulation time, which is also going to be horrendous. But closely related to that is the iteration ability that you're going to have on this. So everybody knows, once they've done a few of these type of elements, that things in the midground and the background tend to get less notes because they're less inspectable, and it's not where a lot of the action and the notes from anyone will actually be coming from. It's kind of more, at that distance, it's more like a supporting element. It's still important, but it's not probably going to generate as many notes as foreground things. Midground things can sometimes get some notes, definitely, but the foreground element is definitely the one that will get the most notes. So splitting up this is a good approach to total amount of data on disk. It's a sensible way to solve iteration problems, because you'll probably, like I said, get less notes on background and midground stuff. You will get notes on foreground, and then you can go, cool, I can just spend my time iterating on this extreme foreground element and do the tweaks that I need to do on that. I will get more iterations done in a day, and I'll get this shot signed off quicker versus trying to do it all in one big monolithic sim. So that's an example of using the voxel res checker to work out how big the res should be for this sim, and sensibly slicing things where it makes sense. Okay, next one is the Frustum Rasterizer. So I've just got my little white water particle sim here, all good. And I think this actually shouldn't be too heavy, so I'll just turn off the blast that I had. So this is the normal rasterizing setup. An important sort of side note, even with a decent GPU, if you want to see a decent amount of fidelity on here, you could easily hit the wall, crash your Houdini session by using all the GPU RAM. So I tend to never visualize any volume tools in Houdini in SOPs from their actual node. I tend to always visualize all this stuff with the volume visualizer, because it gives me a max viz resolution control. And I know when I'm doing big, heavy things, I can set this down to a much nicer limit. Globally, in my Houdini menu up here, I can have this set to 1K or 2K, because sometimes maybe I want to really see how this thing's going to look when it's rasterized accurately. But having a high resolution set there is going to kill you in other places, or having a low resolution set there is lame, because then you need to change it and then generate a new scene view to have those new changes come into effect. I find it a better workflow to leave it globally very high and locally set it very low, and then I can always opt in to how much fidelity I need. So anyway, that's a nice little tip. Looking at this guy, rasterizing, all fine, all cool. It generates quite a lot of data, 64 million voxels. And if we look through the camera, fine, this is how it's going to render. It's going to look great. The Frustum Rasterizer here, the OTL that I've made, that is obviously available to everyone, is just promoting a lot of parameters that are on the actual VDB node and a little bit of logic internally. So we kind of need to do a little bit of math logic in here to work out what the XY voxel resolution should be, which is the XY of the Frustum grid, which obviously is tied to the camera. So this has relationships to do with the camera resolution in X, and Z in depth has a relationship as a scale multiplier for the voxel resolution. So we just once we set this up, the actual VDB rasterized Frustum, which you have had access to. So if you're watching this and you're using Houdini 19 even, you can compile OpenVDB 9.1 and it will have this node in it. So it's been around for a while, and side effects for reasons of locking off the build of OpenVDB that they use, this wasn't available, but it is now available in Houdini 20. So this tool, this logic is available without needing to do any compiling. And this has a bunch of different options on it for setting methods of accumulation, how accurately it goes and creates things. Do you want to optimize it for memory? If you have low memory machines, you can tell this thing to be a little bit slower to create the rasterized result, but don't have such high peak memory usage. So they've thought about a lot of things, and if you want to bake complete camera motion into here or not. And it is complete camera motion. So if you have the camera wildly rotating around these points, when it rasterizes them, they will be rasterized with really nice curved volumes. So it's good for two things. It's not just good for keeping file sizes down. It's good for if you wanted to flip book a bunch of particles that you were turning into, I don't know, I think I've done it in the past where it's stuff coming off a plane, some wash coming off a plane, and I don't want to wear the overhead of rendering. Rasterizing with this setup, because it bakes in the motion blur, I can flip book this really quickly and see exactly how this thing's going to read at render time. So that's another benefit of having this rasterizer that makes true proper motion blur. The previous ones, this guy here, his option to blur was just simply taking the velocity that existed on it and ignoring the camera altogether, which is, not ideal. So the other one takes in the full camera motion. So then we get the result of this to camera looks fine. As you start to spin around it, you'll see that it's not just being culled in outside the frustum, it's orientated to the frustum. So if we start to take things like the resolution in Z, which is the main component of keeping the cache size down, X and Y are very important too because they're orientated to the pixel, not in Cartesian space. But Z is a huge one. So as you start to take the scale, the resolution control, basically the scaler in Z, you'll see that this starts to becomes really obvious that this is a frustum orientated thing. So Z is looking down from the point of the pixel out. If we look through the camera though, even at that horrible reality outside of the camera view, in the camera view, this thing still looks fine. And if you had 100 caches in some huge whitewater shot of some Star Wars movie that may or may not have existed, then you will probably pull this Z resolution scale control down quite low until things started to become an issue. So the result out of this is that, this cache on disk here is much, much smaller, obviously, but it's only got 6.5 million voxels versus the Cartesian one, which is sitting around 64 million voxels. So there's huge issues there as far as saving, and as far as even viewing in the viewport is going to be quicker because your GPU actually has a limit to how many total voxels it can display. So if this thing is generating less total voxels, you're more likely to be able to see a high fidelity version of this thing than if you just rasterized in the normal way. Cool. Last example is Pyro. So with this Pyro stuff, I just did a quick, example of this is coming out naively from the Pyro solver and not having anything happen to it, and it's generating about 36 meg per frame. Next one is having a few of the bells and whistles, all the bells and whistles turned on. And the Pyro post process, which I've mentioned, has all of this. This should be kind of the place you do this. You can do it absolutely on the solver. If you dived into this wrapper, you would see this node sitting inside of it anyway. So what's it doing? It's converting to VDB because volumes coming out of the Pyro solver are not VDB. They're not internally VDB either. Maybe one day that'll change, but for the moment they're Houdini volumes. We're converting it. We're computing min and max by default. Very handy because you can use those values in your shaders and you don't have to go and sample them later. They're stored. We're converting to casting the 16-bit and we're doing our cull volume setup. So we're saying cull the velocity field as a default and resample it as well. So resample it to 2 times, so half the resolution of what it was. And what's the cull mask? By default, we're saying cull it by density. So wherever density doesn't exist, then the velocity is going to be ripped out of this as well. And we can see this by looking at our VDB visualize. So the VDB visualizer, if we template this, you can see this is the main sim. Nothing's been culled out of it. So there's a lot of data sitting around here that we don't need. And if we have a look at this one, we're reducing, oh no, it's the same cache, but just for argument's sake, we're templating that. You can see we've stripped all the voxels out here that don't make any sense, that we don't need for rendering. And on the right is a little bit of extra sort of savings, and that one is using a camera frustum. So we could cull this with the frustum outside of the sim and go to disk. If we're going to do that, then we have obvious concerns that we need to be sure about. One of them is if I'm looking through, I believe it's camera, let's check. What camera am I actually culling this with? Camera 1, cool. Okay, so if we look through camera 1, this thing is fine, it's doing what it's doing. Maybe we say that we know when we render this, that there aren't any lights coming outside of above us for rendering and from the side, so that if we start to cast shadows through here, we're not going to say, hey, this is weird. There should be smoke out here, and the lighting should be really, really affected. This lighting seems weird. When that's the case, you can't really use this culling technique as much. You might need to pad it more, or you might need to leave it alone altogether and not cull it, because maybe there's lighting coming from screen left here and it needs to have been absorbed by all this extra smoke. But quite often we're just generating dust elements that are wafting past screen, and they're supporting, and they're lit fairly basically, and the volumes themselves don't have enough density and detail in them for you to really have a big issue. So that's probably the main caveat with frustum culling. So if you're going to opt into it, you might as well opt into it in the sim. You can do it very, very easily outside of the sim with another VDB node that I think is underused. I think a lot of the time people don't realize it's actually there. So you have your VDB and you can say, all right, here's my VDB. What do I want to cull it by? You say, I want to cull it by the camera, and let's pick the same camera. Cool. So this is much faster than a lot of other 2NDC and other ways of culling volumes. This VDB clip node is a compiled C++ operator, and obviously you can take the culling down to whatever you want it to be. I think that, yeah, this thing is, I've used it on heavy volumes and it's still very, very fast, very, very quick. So, but anyway, if we're going to do this anyway, maybe we want to do it inside the sim so that we save the memory overhead of worrying about voxels that we're still going to delete anyway, and we can do it in the sim. And it's just going to be included in that hip file, but it's just a simple wrangle with a few bits and pieces that I've used different methods of making this wrangle in the past, and one of my colleagues at work had spent some time and wrapped up a little bit more all-encompassing simple one. So we're just kind of using a similar setup here, and in the SOP Pyro, it just needs to be plugged into the advection output, which you can see if you grab this hip file anyway. So that's a way to optimize that stuff. And I think that pretty much brings us back to the end of what we were talking about. So yeah, just to recap about volumes, it's the data overhead is the main one that seems to kill a lot of what we do, and supporting elements of the Frustum rasterizer and camera culling in and out of the sim, not storing any more voxels than you need so rendering is faster, and server IO and disk space, they all play a big part together. And I hope that this was informative.